King of the Harem Heaven, Chapter 12. Like 1910, 1914 was a time of trouble for Benjamin Franklin Purnell. The first time he grabbed me was at an Israelite picnic, a young girl named Augusta Fortney was boldly testifying in a crowded, eager-eared courtroom. I was just 15 then, and I'd gone off to explore the woods and he'd followed me. I kicked him and got away and ran back to the others. But just a few months later, he had a girl named Carrie Ryan bring me into Shiloh. She told me she wanted to show me something. Then he caught me and told her to go watch out the window. Augusta and her sister were foreign harem girls who'd fled the house of David and begun talking freely in the outside world. In an attempt to discredit them, King Ben had written an article describing them as a pair of tramps who'd been banished from the Seventh Kingdom for their sins. He'd ordered his son Coy to take it to a Chicago newspaper and to describe himself as the real author. After its publication, the enraged Fortney sisters had sued for slander. Their suit was technically against Coy Purnell. But as the girls told of their life at Shiloh from the witness chair, everyone knew the long-haired king was the real defendant. At the same time, a man named Mose Clark was suing Ben for seducing his wife. He sent me off in the middle of nowhere for 2 whole years, he was charging in another crowded courtroom. And when I finally got back, I found out he had her living at Shiloh the whole time. Mose and Edith Clark had joined the colony early in 1912. The king had allowed them to go on living together, but he'd ordered them to obey the virgin law strictly. Mose had been given work on the big farm. Edith had been assigned to sweeping and dusting the business offices at Shiloh. One day she accidentally opened a wrong door and seen the seventh divine messenger in bed with a girl named Leah Wright. "Well, Sister Clark," Ben had chuckled, "either come on in and join us or else close the door." Edith had turned and run out of the building, back across the amusement park and through the woods to her cottage. Thinking it over, Ben Purnell had decided she'd most likely tell her husband. He'd called in Francis Thorpe, his executive secretary. "Go out to the farm, get Mose Clark, and bring him straight to me," he'd ordered the little man. Then he'd sent for Esther Johnson, his trusted girl Friday. "Go stay with the Clark woman until you hear from me," he told her. "Don't let her talk to anyone." When Thorpe had brought in Mose Clark, Ben had told him he'd been chosen for the new detachment being sent to High Island. "These are the pioneers of Israel," he'd intoned. "This is a very great honor, especially for a newcomer like yourself." "Edith coming with me?" "You and the other pioneers must first prepare suitable shelter. Would you want your wife to suffer in the wilderness?" Mose Clark had let himself be rushed aboard the Rising Sun without even a chance to say goodbye to Edith. His first winter on High Island had been a terrible one, with the freeze-up coming early and catching a detachment short of food, with some men dying of starvation and others disappearing in attempts to cross the ice. When spring had finally come and the schooner had reached the outpost, Edith Clark had not been aboard. All of Moses' attempts to see the bearded king, vacationing just a short distance away with a select group of girls of Shiloh, had failed. Another severe winter had closed down. One spring night, Mose had finally slipped off in a small skiff, working his way southward on a lake boat and hurrying back to the house of David to find his wife. Only then had he learned that Edith had been part of the inner mystic circle ever since he'd left. The king had ordered her out of their little shack and into Shiloh. He'd worked on her incessantly with Israelite doctrine, explaining that blood purification was absolutely essential to salvation, that only the divine messenger could sow the seeds of purity. With such persistence, he'd eventually won out her resistance. Mose Clark blamed his wife for not putting up more of a fight and filed for divorce, charging Ben with seducing her. As a result of this, and the publicity from the Fortney suit, both the federal government and the state of Michigan launched investigations. Once again, the long-haired prophet sped off for Canada, taking only 2 girls with him in his shiny black new limousine. For Ben Purnell, this was roughing it. Once again, the entire inner mystic circle was married off to guard against the possibility of medical examinations, with Esther Johnson and her new assistant Edith Meldrum arranging the mass production weddings. As an added precaution, they shipped all the harem girls up to High Island for the summer. Then the intricate undercover work of battling the 4 threats to the Seventh Kingdom began. Esther perjured herself uninhibitedly in refuting the forgery charges against her king, blackening the character of the two sisters with a number of stories she later admitted were lies. She made a special trip to Big Rapids in an attempt to convince Governor Ferris that all the charges against the House of David were nothing more than the result of religious prejudices. Potential witnesses were blackmailed with confessions they'd written, forced to give sworn statements exonerating King Ben of any wrongdoing. Some were bought off with sizable cash bribes. Local public officials were reminded that the king had 1,000 votes in his pocket and urged to use their influence in his behalf. With the facts hopelessly clouded in their case, the Fortney girls were awarded only a token judgment of 6 cents. With his wife afraid to testify against the king, the Mose Clark suit did no damage. Finding insufficient evidence, the federal government dropped its investigation and the state of Michigan followed suit. The ingathering of Israel had weathered the most severe storm yet. But Ben Purnell had been deeply worried. Upon his return, he put a crew of his subjects to work digging an elaborate series of tunnels beneath the colony buildings, complete with secret entrances. He ordered a recently converted electrician named Swanson to plan and install a raid warning device with buzzers and flashing lights, an ingenious system by which sentries at various points of the outskirts of the colony could alert him instantly, no matter where he happened to be if mobs or warrant servers showed up. And yet, actually, the bearded prophet had learned nothing from his year of constant trouble. While electrician Swanson was busy working on the wiring, Benjamin Franklin Purnell amused himself by cleansing the blood of his 20-year-old wife, Ruth. About this time, King Ben had a different kind of trouble, one that would naturally become an obsession with a man of his vanity. His hair was turning gray. Afraid this would cast doubt on his claim of being immortal, he had a number of hairdressers work on him in secret. An honest beautician told him the truth. "The only way you'll ever hide those streaks is by dyeing it all black." Sorrowfully, King Ben gave in, first preparing his subjects for the transformation by announcing this in advance as a miraculous omen that the millennium was now very close at hand. Young Coy Purnell renounced the Israelite faith and fled the colony soon after the Fortney suit. His mother was heartbroken. She began slipping large amounts of money out to him, giving him enough so that he started dressing in flashy clothes, entertaining a wild crowd of young friends and drinking heavily. Discovering this, the king ordered his wife to stop. For the first time in their life together, Mary stood up to Ben. "You drove him away," she accused. "You took that girl he liked at Gladys Hill and put her in Shiloh with the rest of them. You got him mixed up in all that court trouble. Well, I'll go on giving him whatever I please. This happens to be a community property state. You try to stop me, I'll see a lawyer about it." King Ben was trapped. He'd originally organized the House of David as a church corporation in order to take advantage of tax laws. The state of Michigan had ruled that the colony was engaging in too many business activities to be considered a church, and Ben had put everything in his own name. "I have been harboring a scorpion," he complained sadly and helplessly to his harem girls. For comfort in her grief at losing her last child, Mary Purnell began turning more and more often to Frances Thorpe, Ben's executive secretary. Considering her age, this may have been nothing more than a close friendship, although a number of Israelites later described it in court as an affair. With all the young ladies at Shiloh to pick from, the loss of his wife's affection still angered Ben. "Mary's little lamb," he called Thorpe in disgust. Realizing her power and flaunting her independence, the queen, who on occasion had even helped procure the girls, now began to object to the king's harem excesses. Ben had gotten into the habit of taking a crowd of inner circle members with him wherever he went, to his office, through the colony grounds, to the amusement park, on inspection tours of his farms and orchards and factories, even to downtown Benton Harbor to the block of business buildings he'd purchased there. He'd also started fondling and kissing them whenever and wherever the whim seized him. Abruptly, Mary told him to start acting with a little more royal dignity. "Benjamin had better begin watching his step around here," several different flying rollers later quoted her. The long-haired prophet had developed 100 cunning ways of fighting court charges and government investigations, But there was no way for him to combat this annoyance. He could only curse beneath his breath and bear it. In 1915, according to the later sworn testimony of a number of Israelite witnesses, a forced initiation into the inner mystic circle ended in tragedy. "He's not a divine being at all," a young girl named Eliza Murphy blurted out to her mother. "He started pulling off my clothes, and when I fought back, he twisted my arms behind me and—" "Not another word!" Mrs. Murphy clamped a hand over the girl's mouth and shook her angrily. "Don't you dare talk like that about King Benjamin. Don't you ever let me hear you say such things again." "But it's the truth," Eliza broke free, sobbing. She was a small, thin-boned girl who looked even younger than her 15 years. "I swear to God it is." "You listen to me." Her mother's face was dark and twisted with rage. "If you want to get yourself banished from the kingdom, if you want to burn with the rest of the world, there's no way I can stop you. But keep that evil talk away from me. I want to stay here." Eliza was forcibly returned to Shiloh, where Cora Mooney angrily ordered her to her room. And then the high priestess questioned her mother suspiciously. "What did she tell you?" "Oh, nothing. She was just a little homesick, I guess." "Was she making up lies about Benjamin?" Cora Mooney asked bluntly. "Well," Mrs. Murphy hesitated, "I don't think. Several of the girls have been doing that lately. It seems to be a conspiracy among them. They don't want to settle down and learn the principles of the sacred writings. So they made up some vicious stories among themselves and threatened to tell them if they're forced to study. They may be too young to realize what a blasphemous thing they're doing, but we certainly can't permit it." "I think she must have just had a bad dream," Mrs. Murphy pleaded weakly. "If you hear evil talk and fail to report it, you share the full guilt," the high priestess warned her. "Now what did Eliza tell you?" "She's really a good girl. She wouldn't—" "What did she say?" Cora Mooney shouted. "Well, that King Benjamin was doing things to her, things a mortal man might do. But don't worry, I brought her back and I made her promise." "All right," the high priestess interrupted her. "You can go now. But if you hear evil talk again, you're to report it immediately." After Mrs. Murphy had left, beefy, thick-set Cora Mooney took from a desk drawer an object that seemed strangely out of place in that world of bearded men, a razor strop. Then she went up the stairs to the young Murphy girl's room. When the first piercing scream split the midday quiet of Shiloh, most of the second-floor girls merely cowered in their rooms. But a few, like Hazel Ruth Wade and a girl named Gladys Bamford, hurried down the hall and pounded on the bolted door. Then Esther Johnson and an older office worker named Estelle Meldrum came rushing up the stairs to join them. "What's going on?" they demanded when Cora Mooney opened the door and closed it behind her, dimming the sound of steady sobbing there. The leather strap still hung from her hand. "I've just been giving Eliza Murphy a little something she had coming," the high priestess told them calmly. "She was telling lies about Benjamin." But even after the beating, the little Murphy girl remained rebellious. None of the bearded king's arguments, none of his promises of eternal life, or his threats of eternal damnation could persuade her to give in to his purification rites. Eliza fought him with all the strength in her slim body. Only by direct, brutal force was the long-haired prophet able to see that her blood was properly cleansed. He took her along on his last vacation trip to High Island that year. And when she still remained stubborn there in the roundhouse, he decided that an even stronger form of discipline was needed. There was another rebel in his harem at the time, a girl named Jessie Wheeler. As he was preparing to sail for Benton Harbor, he took the two of them aside. "I've been extremely patient with you both," he told them, "but your attitude toward the purification rites is open sacrilege and heresy, and this cannot be tolerated any longer. You'll promise me now that you'll perform these rites in the future with the proper respect and humility, or else you'll remain here on the island for the winter." The two girls faced him in stubborn silence. "All right," he muttered grimly. "We'll see." Benjamin Franklin Purnell was certain that when he returned in the spring, he'd find this pair thoroughly chastised, ready to submit humbly to his ministering, ready to show some appreciations for the advantages life at Shiloh offered over the life the rank-and-file Israelites led. But it didn't work out quite that way. There in the Siberia of Israel, with only the banished, the aged, and the insane for company, where driven snow swirled incessantly, where the wind shrieked like a screaming girl and stabbed relentlessly through the crude tar paper shacks, the two teenage Israelites lost all interest in both the promised eternal life to come and life here and now. They found a sack of the white powdered arsenic used to spray the vegetable gardens, mixed it with water, closed their eyes, and swallowed it quickly. Jesse Wheeler choked on the milk-colored fluid, threw most of it back up, and suffered only severe stomach cramps. Eliza Murphy kept it down, and on the far side of the island, King Ben's hired squaw man chopped out another unmarked grave in the frozen ground. In 1916, Ben Purnell did a very foolish, childish thing. Hazel Ruth Wade, Salvation Nell, had been religiously obeying his commandments through the half-dozen years that she had gone by since her forced marriage to Irving Smith. She'd humbly submitted to his booster shots of blood cleansing. She worked the countryside tirelessly in search of converts for him, with Irving driving the team and setting up the platform and torches for her camp meetings. Living together in a small covered wagon on one tour after another, the young couple had religiously obeyed their King's Virgin law. But one night on the road, happy and excited after an unusually successful meeting, Hazel Ruth impulsively embraced Irving and kissed him on the cheek. He pushed her away, stared at her in horror, then broke out sobbing. "What have you done?" he cried again and again. "What have you done?" Sick inside with guilt and fear, Hazel Ruth still tried to comfort him. "It was all my fault, and I'll say so when I confess it," she promised him. Tormented by visions of eternal punishment, they gave up the tour and turned back for Benton Harbor the next morning, hardly speaking to each other throughout the long trip. Upon her return, Hazel Ruth wrote out a full confession of the incident. If King Ben had used the same shrewdness in managing his harem that he used in business matters, he'd have quietly forgiven the girl and retained her loyalty. But by this time, the mere thought of another man as much as touching one of his girls was enough to send him into blind, unreasoning rage. "An act of lust!" he shouted. "A contemptible, bestial act of lust!" The incident became an insane fixation with him. At the next service, his voice thundering above the noises of the busy amusement park, he ordered her to her feet and gave her an unmerciful tongue lashing. The entire colony began turning their heads when she approached, refusing to answer her greeting. Heartbroken, Hazel Ruth Wade fled into the evil and sinful outside world. Once among normal people, the shy little hymn singer soon realized just how much of a dupe she'd been. Living with her sister Edna for a time, then visiting her father in Indiana, she came to look upon the dozen years she spent in the colony as an incredible nightmare. In 1917, she returned to Benton Harbor, unafraid, determined to get her kid sister Cletus out of Ben's clutches. Something about this previously timid and soft-voiced girl worried the bearded king so much that he stayed out of town during her return. He had Esther Johnson get a statement exonerating him of any wrongdoing from Cletus. He desperately wanted a similar statement from Hazel Ruth, but even though the offer was raised to several $1,000s, Salvation Nell wasn't buying it. The moment her sister was safe, she went all the way to Washington, camped on President Wilson's doorstep until he gave her an audience, then told him exactly what was going on at the House of David. Woodrow Wilson listened politely, but turned the matter over to his secretary Joseph Tumulty. Tumulty sent the girl to the Justice Department, where she was merely referred from one office to another until she finally gave up. The federal government had a few more serious things to worry about at the time than a fake prophet king keeping a harem in a small Michigan city. The United States of America had just gone to war. When the first draft boards were set up, King Ben promptly notified them that his domain was a separate kingdom owing allegiance only to God, and that his subjects were not subject to conscription. The government failed to agree with this and drafted the Israelites anyway. Furious at being robbed of a good share of his labor supply, Ben Purnell made the most of the situation. Once again, he married off his entire current harem to young flying roller men. But this group marriage had a different purpose than the earlier ones. All through the war, some 50 or more allotment checks were dropped into the mailbox at Shiloh each month to be promptly endorsed by the inner circle members and promptly cashed by their lord and master. You had to get up pretty early in the morning to beat old King Ben.